Colin Farquharson is going to talk to us about modeling and inversion. Colin has a BSc in geophysics from Edinburgh University, a PhD in geophysics from the University of British Columbia, working with Doug Oldenburg as a supervisor, and then stayed on for a postdoc and research associate at UBC, also with the Geophysical Inversion facility there for a few years, and then moved to Memorial University in 2005. Colin's now an associate professor in the Earth Sciences Department at Memorial University. Take it away, Colin.
Super, thanks very much, John. And thanks again, John, and to the organizers for asking me to come and give this presentation today. Definitely an honor. First off, I just want to acknowledge my co-author on this presentation and the abstract, Peter Liliev. I've been fortunate enough to have Peter work with me for quite a number of years now as a postdoc and a research associate, developing all sorts of weird and wonderful and great inversion algorithms and software. And so he also contributed to this presentation. Just quickly rattling through the outline to set things up. First, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction in which I give a couple of comments saying what this presentation is not about. Then I want to go through the types of Earth models, because that seems to be one of the themes that's been happening over the last few years, and which I think will continue to happen, is that there's now a much broader range of the types of computer Earth models that we can use and that we can work with. Then I'll kind of tell the story a little bit. The next bit will be sort of the review, in my mind, of the last decade or so in terms of inversion. And so moving through from minimum structure inversion, then constrained inversion, and then integrated imaging and all the various flavors of that. All those are going to be general in terms of geophysics. There's one very particular advancement in the last few years that has happened that's particular to a certain data type, and that's inverting for the direction of magnetization rather than just susceptibility. Then spend a few minutes doing the fun stuff. What are sort of my ideas, Peter and my ideas for how things will go in the next few years. As for what this is not, so first off, apologies. We're trying to be impartial, a review of what has happened over the last 10 years, and we're trying to filter out our biases in terms of what we think is cool and interesting. So hopefully impartial. In terms of the presentation and the abstract, all the examples, the pictures, and the references are taken from the literature. So I'm not going to mention any companies here at all. But basically all the technology that I indicate or talk about is available in one form or another out there in the commercial realm. Also, this talk's going to be all pictures. No math at all pictures. And sometimes it turns out that the best papers, the most famous papers on certain methods don't have the best pictures. And so maybe there's pictures up here that you might not expect to see for illustrating certain methods. So if you're out in the audience and you don't see any of your stuff up here, then sorry. Okay, so a couple of things that are really important that this talk is not going to cover. And the first one I want to emphasize, but I guess not spend too much time on, is physical properties. Because as this talk goes on, it's going to be all this business about Earth models. And certainly on the geophysics side, there's 3D variation of our physical properties through the subsurface. But of course, that's not geology. And there's this whole huge step of getting from that geophysical Earth model to geology. And that's where physical properties comes in. Way back in 1988 in the classic green and white EM textbook, Pawlacki in his chapter was referring to the weak link, kind of, for the physical properties, and the most neglected area back in the 80s of exploration sequence. Maybe it's not quite as bad now as it is back then. There's been plenty of people doing work on this, and this is just a couple of illustrations. Randy Enkin from lots of measurements on samples in British Columbia, susceptibility, density, also plots like this showing physical property measurements, nicely organized. This was a nice picture in terms of cross-plot of density and susceptibility, and yes, various units from this paper where, things do nicely sort of separate out in this cross-plot of physical properties. So physical properties are super important, but I certainly am not qualified to talk about them, so I'm not going to mention them any further in this presentation. Yikes. Computer code. The other thing that this is not going to be about is the methods for synthesizing data, and this might be a difference from previous decades. And so, I'm overstating the case here a little bit, but essentially we can synthesize, we can compute any kind of geophysical data that we would like for any kind of Earth model that we would like. I mean, in terms of, people are routinely, or certainly doing often enough, full 3D inversions of airborne EM data, whereas maybe 10 years ago we were still hoping to, if only we could do our 3D EM numerical modeling. But now, essentially, we've done that. I mean, yeah, we can improve things, and there's nice technical details and advances that can be made, but essentially, we're now in a situation where, yeah, synthesizing any kind of data set is doable. And so because of that, I think, as a result of that, there's this sort of plethora developing of types of computer Earth models that are now available for us to work with. So I kind of want to rattle through these a little bit. And so, there's definitely the geological computer Earth models. So this is a fairly old image now, but this is the red here is the triangular tessellated wireframe surface outlining the ovoid massive sulfide deposit up at Voisey's Bay. The yellow surface, again, you can see all the nice triangular tessellations. That's the boundary between the troctolite and the gneiss. And then there's the topographic surface on top. The point here is that this is a computer model, 3D computer model, that is parameterized in terms of these surfaces. This is just another example, much larger scale. Ernst Schätzler and colleagues did this. There is a sort of scale bar on here to indicate this is much larger scale, 1 kilometer. This little subset here is, I think, in this section. So much larger scale where these geological Earth models have been built. It's the surfaces in those geological models that are parameterized, usually in terms of these little triangular tessellations, and for fairly complex, complicated geological models. As for the geophysics side, this is our classic, our standard rectilinear mesh, nice flat planes, vertical planes, dividing our subsurface up into little voxels, little cells, brick-like elements, whatever you want to call them. And then we're just assuming that the physical property within each of those cells is the same. And yeah, okay, that can vary from one cell to the next, but this is our standard classic pixelated, voxelated image of the subsurface. A lot more on that later, but there's also been a number of other developments where you can start from that rectilinear setup, which does have lots of advantages for your numerical modeling, but then do the non-conformal business with your cells, where you take your bigger cell and then moving from this one into this one, dividing it up into 4 or 8. This allows you to refine the model in certain regions of interest. It also allows you to refine the models where you might need to for your computational techniques. So a more sophisticated style of model, these OcTree meshes, non-conforming meshes. There's also the fully unstructured kind of mesh where the base cell is now not a hexahedral brick-like element, but is a tetrahedron, 4-sided tetrahedron. Those are particularly good because they can fit totally against the little triangular facet on the surfaces in your geological model. And so, hey, you can just divide up your 3D Earth model of the subsurface in terms of these little tetrahedra, and that is then how your 3D Earth model lives inside your computer. There's also a lot of other ways of doing it. There's these hybrid methods. So this one here, I'm going to need to point this one out, but this model is comprised of columns. So each one of these stripes is indeed one column. These vertical boundaries do not move during the course of an inversion if you're doing an inversion. The previous models that I showed you, yes, those interfaces are fixed, whereas here, these interfaces are fixed, but these horizontal surfaces, those can go up and down during the inversion, so it's kind of a hybrid style of model, particularly good for certain types of models, typically uses a smaller number of parameters, so it can be quicker and more efficient to work with. So there's this spectrum of possible ways of describing our Earth model in the computer, whether it's on the geological side or on the geophysics side. As for sort of the review of what has happened perhaps in the last 10 years and what's happening right now, so there's the classic minimum structure inversion, which has worked really well, continues to work really well, and we shouldn't forget that, certainly those of us trying to come up with grand and glorious new ways of doing it. So this is just one example. This is actually from Doug Oldenburg and Yago Lee's paper on the depth of investigation. So that's a classic sort of fuzzy blob model, but a very nice fuzzy blob model. And in terms of the inversion, so we got our little cells, rectilinear mesh, inverting for the the conductivity, well, the chargeability in each little cell. And so in doing the inversion, yes, we've got our measure of how well our synthetic data match the observed data, and we want to minimize that, so we're telling the computer to minimize that. But we're also adding in there to the optimization problem a measure of how complicated the model is, and doing that in a way that produces a nice, simple, smeared out, smooth model. Originally, the idea for doing that was to make sure we didn't get any artifacts in the model that could be misleading, but a very practical consequence of that makes a very stable, reliable algorithm. You're trying to make sure your model doesn't get too complicated or too complex at any stage, and so it just remains nice and simple, doesn't fall apart, doesn't go crazy, and so that's why this minimum structure style of inversion has been so successful. It is possible to adapt it and expand it a bit. I mean, you can tweak that measure of how complicated things are to try and get, well, away from the fuzzy blobness and piecewise constant models where you have more uniform looking geological units, or you can encourage the value of the physical property in any one of these cells to perhaps be of one chargeability or another through clustering or multivariate, no, not multivariate, multinary inversion that Michael Stanoff and his group does. So there's ways where you can adapt this basic minimum structure inversion approach, but still not stepping too far away from this reliable and robust way of doing it, which is a great advantage of this, the minimum structure approach. That's why it's worked so well, why it continues to work so well. As for developments, though, because people have been pushing to try and do things a bit better, what I think is the single most important thing over the last 10 years, and what we should now be using is this whole constrained minimum structure inversion, where one of the things that you add in there, in a number of different ways of doing it, but perhaps is a reference model, which contains some idea of what you think the geology is, based on real measurements or on hypothesized ideas, and then you encourage the model that your inversion is constructing to be as close as possible to that reference model or to be within bounds. This is just an example from Nick Williams' PhD thesis. And this is sort of the example without any constraints at all for his inversion of the magnetic data for the susceptibility model. And then this is the much more detailed, much more focused model that you get when you tell the inversion that, yeah, the susceptibility should be in this part of the model as opposed to, well, just stick it anywhere you want. So constrained based on geological information has been important. This is just another example. This is a synthetic case from Boise's Bay. The dipping region of variations of sulfide content that's more dense in this gravity model. If you just do the unconstrained, you do get the fuzzy blob. But if you tell the inversion that you know down in this sort of bottom left-hand corner of the model that the dense sulfide cannot be there, then the inversion goes, okay, well, I'll stick it over here instead, and which turns out to be where it should be. So getting the geological information into the process through a constrained means of doing it, this adaptation of the minimum structure is totally possible and a number of ways of doing it. There's also recently this whole joint inversion, or a resurgence recently, shall we say. It's been rattling around, the idea's been rattling around for a long time. There's a number of sort of terms that seem to get used. The umbrella term at the moment seems to be integrated imaging, and there's a number of ways of doing it. Try and take two different data sets and invert them somehow together to get two models that are the same, or one model, or some jointly way of doing it. So what are the different ways of doing it? There's joint inversion, where the two or more types of data go into the same program, and you have your two or more different models that you try and encourage to be the same during the inversion process, or there's something about them you want to be the same. And this is just an example. Whoops. Finally, it got me the wrong button. Seismic tomography, MT data, and gravity data, 3 sets of data. Inverted separately, you get these different models. If you invert them all at the same time, and also do the structural business where you encourage all the models to have gradients in the same sort of place. So in terms of having a sharpish gradient here and in here, and not necessarily in this one, through this joint coupling, structural coupling. There's an alternative way of doing it where this coupling is based on the physical property plot. So this is an example Boden in Sweden, done by Yaguali and Jajasan. So this is a plot of susceptibility against density based on physical property measurements. This is the expected trend for these two physical properties in the region. And if you invert the gravity data and the magnetic data at the same time, asking for smooth, simple models, but asking for the physical property in any particular cell to be close to this trend, then you can get a result that is better. And each little blue dot here corresponds to a single model, a single cell in the model. And so the closer these blue dots are to the red line means that the closer the susceptibility and density in that cell is to one of the expected trends in that region. So this joint inversion all-in-one program based on physical properties. In order to do that joint inversion, you do need a single joint inversion code, and those are not trivial to write. So there's a number of different ways of trying to accomplish the same end result, but not getting that monolithic code. One is cooperative inversion, where you iterate backwards and forwards between your two different inversion codes using the update of one to update the other and sort of alternate backwards and forwards. There is also this lithologic segmentation process where you just do your different inversions independently and get the models out at the end. So in this case, the p-wave velocity model, gradient to the p-wave, and then an MT conductivity section, and then just use some machine learning kind of algorithm to try and pick up trends or similarities between those three different models. And then based on the regions in the model that you get, based on those trends, you can start to identify potential rock types within these three different models. So this lithologic segmentation based on inversion results from totally independent inversions. So this is probably now starting to be into the realm of research. These are definitely academic papers. The people arguing as to which is the best way to do it, but of course there's not only is there the best possible end result, but there's also the practicality of how one goes about doing it. The lithologic segmentation, you're just using pre-existing inversion codes and just add on a bit at the end. So there's probably not yet clear how this will proceed into the future, shall we say. So everything so far applicable to pretty much any kind of geophysics, but in terms of this full magnetization vector, specifically for magnetic data, so recent advancement, again, idea rattled around a little bit in academia for a while, but now you see an uptake in the industry. So just to point out this picture, so instead of just inverting for the susceptibility in each cell in our model, one is inverting for the full-on magnetization as a vector quantity. So this, the constructed model has vectors in it, arrows, so strength and direction. This makes the inverse problem a lot more non-unique, so you have to do something to counteract that. This particular work, they use clustering, so minimum structure algorithm, but build in a bit of clustering to try and encourage a few distinct types of units. And let's see, there's two units, two general trends in this model, one with the magnetization straight down, one with the magnetization straight up, and one with inclination of 6 degrees down. And if you look clearly at this, carefully at this picture, those arrows are mostly pointing down in various strengths, but this region in the middle, all the arrows are pointing up. So the magnetization in the central region corresponding to the magnetic low is an oppositely magnetized unit, shall we say. So this business of inverting for the vector, not just the susceptibility, that's been seen a significant increase in use in the last few years. Okay, as for what might happen, some of the different ways that things could progress in the future, what are some people looking at in terms of the new ways of doing it, new ideas? There's the geological models based on their surfaces, based on their interfaces, and those are being used an awful lot, implicit modeling, to build those from structural geological information. So maybe we should be doing that for our geophysics. And so here's an example of, here's an example of a geophysical model parameterized in terms of a surface. That surface is made up of all your little triangular facets, and we're just moving that surface around to try and reproduce our geophysical data. So a surface-based, interface-based geophysical inversion, totally sort of mimicking the setup for geological models. There's some of the slightly different techniques of doing this where you're trying to construct a model that is one uniform unit inside another, and it's really that interface that you're trying to reconstruct. There's a mathematical way of doing it called level set, totally analogous to contour lines in a topographic map. You can do that in geophysics. That is how people are doing their implicit modeling for their geological Earth models. And this is just a nice, neat diagram to illustrate that, where you might have your measured strike and dips at a number of locations. You may have observed your contact of interest at a few locations. You then do the math, come up with a potential function such that the zero contour surface of that potential function, and that's this gray surface here, that then becomes your geological surface that is reproducing the observed geological data. So it's very much just like our geophysical inverse problems, but totally in the geological realm. One thing that we still can't do in the geophysics inverse problem is come up really with any idea of the uncertainty in our model parameters. So we generate a model, we say, yeah, this fits the data, we like how it looks, but how well do we know some of those features in there? This is just a quick example of a 1D inversion of one sounding from an airborne EM data set, real data. And this was just done where sampling, randomly generating a whole lot of 1D Earth models, seeing if they fit the data. If they do, plot them up here, and essentially where there's this greater intensity of the grayness, that shows you where most of the models are plotting. And it gives you some idea of the variability and resistivity and also depth of this interface. So this business to try and come up with quantification of how well we know the features in our models, that's something that we haven't really been able to come close to doing, shall we say, in the geophysical inverse problem. So conclusions. So one way into the future might be to totally try and couple the surface-based 3D geological models and, hey, some 3D surface-based geophysical models, and basically just have the one single model that we manipulate. We maybe use an inversion process to fully invert or semi-automatically invert one stage at a time to try and come up with this interface-based model that totally fits our geophysical data and also our geological data. Lots of pros, attractive features to that, also a lot of challenges, shall we say. Or, I mean, just keep with this rectilinear-based mesh, use the increased computer power to get this as fine a resolution as possible. I mean, some of those high-definition, ultra-definition 4K TV screens these days, those are ridiculously fine pixel size, ridiculously high definition. So do we just head in that direction for our 3D geophysical modeling, still go with the minimum structure inversion, nice and robust, maybe just adapt it every now and again to do our constrained or our joint inversion, or maybe some lithologic segmentation based on results coming out of our individual geophysical inversions. So definitely focusing on the robust aspect, the practical aspect, and not over-engineered. And of course, in some ways, that's a bit of a contrived question, I guess. So the last slide, contrived, I mean, both of these are going to happen, and arguably it's not arguably, definitely the case that the important thing is that we now have more tools available to us, and a broader suite of tools. And so this opens up the possibility of, if it is worth it, if it is worth the time and effort, then yeah, we can do some more sophisticated modeling, geological and geophysical modeling, than we could do in the past. But we do also have the nice basic fundamental minimum structure inversion that, depending on your explanation set scenario, might be perfectly adequate for what you're doing. So that's it. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Very nice. We have time for a few questions, if there are any from the audience. Too much math in there, Colin.
Sorry, yes.
Is there a question? Oh, okay. Repeat the question.
So the question is, I said that physical properties were important, but how do we get that into the inversion process, whether it's constrained or one of these fancy interface-based models? Really good question, I don't know. I mean, aside from how we do it at the moment, in the context of that minimum structure setup, we just build our pixelated model that we geophysicists say, oh, that's our geological model, where we just fill each cell with a number that's supposed to represent the physical property of that unit in that cell, and then we just go with our geophysical inversion to try and get the physical property close to that. But that in no way represents the possible variability, the possible uncertainty in that value, never mind the sort of elephant in the room whereby, is the physical property measured in the lab the same thing as connectivity? Is it the same thing as the physical property we're sensing with our MT survey with a scale length of a lot bigger than a lab? I don't know. I mean, it's statistical methods maybe, but yeah, I'm not sure. But it's totally important, yes. Yes, I totally agree. And then,
Can you just
yes.
summarize it a little bit?
Alan Jones just saying that work has already been done that involves looking at the petrophysical relationships or the thank you, the major element chemistry down in the mantle, relating that through the physical properties, through experimental results and trends. Do you have? I mean, is there a quantifying the trends using formulas and then building that into the inverse problem so that you're kind of inverting from your geophysical data measured at the surface through the physical property in the Earth model to the chemistry of the rocks at depth. Yes, I mean, in that situation, we totally need the relationship. We need to have confidence in the relationship between the physical property that our geophysical data is sensitive to and the geochemical data that we're using to characterize the subsurface. And to get that into the inversion, we need that as a formula or at least something with a statistical mean and standard deviation. So yeah, I mean, definitely a possibility. It would be a good thing to try.
So physical properties matter.
Oh, physical properties totally matter. That's I mean, it's just cool and pretty pictures, but is it geology? I mean, to get to the geology, it's physical properties.
Okay, thanks again, Colin.